Hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So I think we should probably introduce ourselves for the benefit of the Blogging Head viewers. I am Greg Marx. I'm a staff writer at the Columbia Journalism Review, and I'm an editor of our United States project, which is a project we have to use correspondents around the country to sort of critique and hopefully constructively criticize and support local journalism around the country.
And I am Jay McDonnell. I'm the executive director of the Online News Association, which is a nonprofit membership organization of digital journalists. We have about a little over 2,000 members right now.
Cool. And I should mention that we're having this conversation as part of Blogging Head's Democracy in America series. Um, and we've done a couple other episodes, or CJR has done a couple of other episodes in the series in the past. So, Jane, I wanted to sort of start by noting that we're in kind of an interesting moment in digital journalism. At the sort of the 30,000 feet perspective, there's been a ton of news over the past 6 weeks or so about um, developments in the industry. Ezra Klein going to Vox. Um, we're still anticipating the 538 relaunch. There are new projects at the Times, at the Post, and elsewhere. And there's been sort of tons of discussion about sort of where we are, what this moment is, often about projects that we haven't actually seen yet. At the same time, obviously, people are still there does continue to be innovation and development in actual journalism that we can read and consume and not just speculate about. Um, so I'm curious what you see as sort of like the most salient or interesting things happening in sort of the field of digital journalism right now, and are there any sort of particular developments that you're most excited to see unfold over the next 6 months?
Yeah, it seems to be an ongoing conversation, right? There's always been so much happening. I think over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been, I think, questionably, you could call it a renaissance. I think some people don't see it that way. But it's interesting to me that this type of thing has been happening over the past decade or more. And every time there's a new sort of pivot point, uh, people are having the same reaction, which is a sort of a mix of despair, disappointment, worry, some envy, some
Envy, definitely.
yeah, some people feeling as though journalism as we know it is destroyed, and others feeling very excited. I'm sort of in the excited camp, and not just because I have to be, because we sort of represent digital journalism, but mostly because I see this kind of a change where professional journalists are striking out on their own to do really creative, innovative things, which may or may not be successful. The jury's going to be out on that for a long time. Um, just as a really healthy development, I think there are a lot of people who've been feeling frustrated because they haven't been able to, for one reason or another, whether it's because they work for a giant media corporation that turns like the Titanic very slowly, and they feel they need to do what they want to do now. Um, and I think that that's based on a lot of different motives that of public interest and public the right to know, all of the various tools and great technology that are out there that aren't being used to the best of their ability. Many, many different reasons, but people are thinking, let's go out there and try it. And
Hmm.
let me make new partnerships or relationships. Let me just strike on my own. Let me just do it. And I see that as being incredibly healthy and exciting. Um, the all of the most recent ones, and the most obvious ones you've mentioned. People leaving places like the Washington Post or the New York Times. Bill Keller's now can be striking
Right.
out on his own. Those are, I think, a loss for obviously the institutions that they're leaving, and there is no way to replace that kind of wisdom and experience. and that's a shame. There's no other way to say it. But I'm glad that those folks are still staying in journalism. I'm glad they're not taking their talents and skills elsewhere, and that they're thinking very proactively and innovatively about the future of the field.
Um, so you sort of talked about editorial and sort of technological opportunities in passing there. One of the interesting things that we're one of the interesting parts of the recent discussion has been about, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about the role of CMS, or even whether that's even the right word, and sort of different digital publishing platforms. But there's also been a little bit of discussion about sort of different editorial approaches. Ezra Klein at Vox has again, we haven't seen what he's done, but whereas it feels like for a long time there's been a lot of concern, certainly in newspapers and traditional newsrooms, that essentially the imperative of the internet is to publish on something like something like a Politico model, sort of a hyper frenetic pace. Recently, that obviously has been a vogue for long form. There's but Ezra has talked about something that sounds almost a little bit like like the living story experiment that was briefly tried and abandoned a few years ago. Almost sounds like a little bit like of a Wikipedia for news. One of our contributors, Brendan Nyan, wrote a piece about the great work that Grantland is doing to sort of blend data analysis with multimedia in a narrative, in sort of a narrative model. Are there, and I know that you've through ONA, I mean, you guys are seeking specific individuals who are doing entrepreneurial, innovative things who are not as famous as Ezra and Grantland. So are there particular sort of editorial or technological innovations that you're specifically excited about right now?
Yeah, I think, well, just generally, all of the new announcements that have been made over the past couple of weeks, it really has been coming fast and furiously. It's almost as though somebody hit a button and, everybody decided, okay, it's time to do this. I think all of those are really interesting ideas. I'm always, one thing that I feel pretty strongly about is the use of technology, finding new ways to use technology to really give richness and depth to reporting, to distribution, and I think data journalism is just hugely important, and I think we're only just beginning to tap into it. There are a lot of smart people out there who are thinking about how to do it. One of the things that, just to jump to an O&A kind of initiative now that really speaks to this, and something that we think is very important is, you mentioned, there's folks out there now doing work that are much lesser named, lesser famous, and we really see our role as trying to find those people and to support them, identify, support them, and share their work. So a few of the initiatives we've had have been looking at what younger journalists are doing, and by younger I mean anywhere from college age to under 30 professionals. The importance of the reason why we do it is because we see that digital natives are looking at the issue of journalism and media and how it works and how it can work in much different ways than professional journalists are looking at it. What they lack in journalistic background and experience, they are bringing and making up for in just pure innovation and thinking differently. So our programs have been really geared towards college students who are at the intersection of journalism and technology, which we think of as computer science for the most part, and trying very hard to identify them and then give them scholarships that will help them do that through the AP Google Scholarship. There's a class of 6 so far. There'll be another 2 this year. And then The most recent piece of this has been the Challenge Fund for Innovation for Journalism Education, which we just closed the applications for that. And I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, were totally surprised by the reaction to that. We had expected maybe 60 to 70 applications, and when we closed down, there were 125. And then looking through those applications, I mean, I'm not giving anything away. We're going to be selecting through those. The amount of innovation and creativity that's out there, just kind of begging to be let loose, is pretty astonishing. And I think it kind of speaks to this whole movement right now of people striking off on their own. And what I'm seeing is that data journalism, working with data, working with tools and technology, collaboration, which is, I think, somewhat new.
Collaboration between whom?
Between nonprofits and for-profit, between citizen journalism and professional journalists, between tools and technology, companies and journalists. There were pretty bright lines before about who you would work with and why and what their motives were. I think there's less and less of that now. Just to bring up another instance of where that's happening, that we see it happening and where we're encouraging it, is at our annual conference. We started 2 years ago in the Midway, and that is a purely collaborative space where journalists and sort of the big players like Twitter and Google and Facebook, they're all there, but also very small startups, journalism startups, some of the night grantees who have won News Challenge funds, people who are really thinking creatively about how to use tools. And we're putting them in the same room together, and we're saying, okay, let's just play, and let's see what happens. And there have been some startups that have actually developed through that. There have been journalists who have gotten jobs in places they probably never thought they would get jobs before, because they thought they hadn't been thinking really creatively about how to use their skills. So that's sort of where I see the real strength of this is that, yes, there's a big loss to some of the institutions, the journalism institutions that we all respect and hope will continue and be healthy. But there are these new partnerships and relationships starting up that I think are pretty exciting.
So when you're talking about relationships between journalism organizations and other companies, are you mostly talking tech companies?
Yeah, I think there's a whole wealth of small startup tech companies. I'm not just even speaking about the big obvious, Google is going to partner with a major media company to do X.
Right.
I'm talking about small journalism startups, small technology startups who are actually gearing their tools towards journalists, and before, I think they'd be thought of as vendors or, just commercial, which they are, of course. They're for profits. But what they're thinking about is, how do we make journalists do their job better? How do we help them do that? And so they're creating and developing specific tools that will work with journalists. I mean, NewsCred is doing that. Chartbeat is doing that. There's so many of them out there, and there's more cropping up every day. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. I think most of the attention is obviously, for obvious reasons, on the media companies and the journalists and the reporters and what they're doing, and also within the journalism community, the developers and the data journalists, which is great. But I think there's also these incredible opportunities to really develop the tools that you need and want with these other companies.
So I was gonna ask you to go back to something you said before about sort of the ways in which these younger journalists sort of see these issues or sort of understand these issues or tackle them differently. So is one of them that essentially there's less squeamishness than there might have been in the past about collaboration with these sort of private for-profit companies?
Yeah, I think that there's a different, because they're digital natives and because they live their life essentially on the web, and also use are the first early adapters of tools and technology. I think there's this feeling that it's just an intrinsic part of what they do. Um, I think there's a really great lesson to be learned there. I think where the wisdom of the professional journalists and the experience comes in is kind of evaluating um, eventually, the good of these tools. Like, what are the downsides? Obviously, people have seen that with, to a certain extent, privacy issues with Facebook and Twitter and Google. But I don't know that anyone's come to the conclusion that it's not worth not using them because we're worried about this. I think the general consensus is, at least among people who are extensive users of that technology, is let's figure out how to make it work. Let's work with these companies to. One example I'll just throw out is we just recently did a design workshop in Boston with the Boston Globe with a grant from McCormick to try to figure out how social media was used or not used correctly during the Boston Marathon bombing. And
Right.
we had a huge, it wasn't huge actually, it was a small group of people, but there were social media experts from journalism organizations. Twitter was there, a lot of smaller tech companies who work on social media were there. But we also brought in the public, and we also brought in the Boston public safety officials. So we had someone from the FBI there, we had someone from the police department, we had somebody from the hospitals to talk about how social media impacted that emergency response, and had the journalists and the companies sit and listen to that whole conversation. They were part of that conversation. What we saw was that everyone was intensely interested in making things better. I mean, everybody, of course, had their own individual, interest here. But the ultimate goal was, let's try to figure out, whether it's a tool or whether it's a new process, let's figure out how we could do this better. When there's something like this happens again, we don't make the same mistakes where we're not doing good verification, we're sharing things that are wrong. And everyone was very open about what mistakes have been made. That's a whole different paradigm, I think, for journalists. First of all, to admit you're wrong, and second of all, to figure out how to correct that. And I think that's one really exciting new development that's come out of this big, sort of upheaval.
Got it. Is there a write-up of that somewhere?
Yeah, it's on our site. We actually shared with the community, with anyone who wanted to see it, the write-up from the actual day. And then we are continuing that, too, because there were actually some tools and technology that we thought we could maybe even help produce. People were interested enough to kind of continue that conversation.
For verification? Like,
For verification.
what is yeah.
Yeah, like, we had little groups of folks who came up with ideas and just had to present them. And one or two of those ideas were, pretty, I think, doable. So, we're hoping that we can help support them to move forward on those too.
So it sounds like the focus is on improvement. What was there a verdict rendered on the performance of social media during the during the marathon bombing?
Yeah, I think it was sort of a split decision. I think that again it comes back to, there's obviously these downsides to using social media and to opening up to the community to source and to find new information and details. The guy who was down the street who saw the police fight between the bombers and the cops. That type of thing. But at the same time, I think that everyone realizes that it's enriching the experience, and it's also providing in-depth, eventually what becomes in-depth news reporting. So, but I guess, my point kind of is that the hand-wringing and the tearing out of the hair, that didn't happen at all. I mean, people were excited about the fact that they were having an honest conversation and that there were people in the room who they wouldn't have had access to otherwise to think about how to improve it. I mean, improvement is the goal, right? We all want to get better. Uh,
Right.
yeah.
So to go back to the relationship with tech for a moment, and to sort of play crusty Luddite newsroom guy.
I'm used to
So I mean,
that.
what? Yeah, I bet. Um, so sort of two questions. I mean, is there any, as journalism? I mean, and this is hardly a new thing. I mean, news, the oldest, most tradition-oriented newspaper, if it's online, it's depending on Facebook now. So this is and has been for a while. So this is like, so but the for traffic, I mean, but is there anything to worry about as news organizations develop closer, or sort of more intimate relationships with tech companies? Either in terms of, is there anything to worry about in terms of um, coverage of that industry, which is an obviously an increasingly important industry, and it's only going to be more so, or a sense of like, is there anything to worry about in terms of um, building projects together with in sort of partnership with companies that may not have um, news, culture, ethics, etc., all that. So I imagine you've responded to these questions many times, but interested in what your response is.
Yeah. Well, maybe not many times, but yeah. I think it's an incredibly good question. I don't get tired of answering because I think it's a really important question, and it goes to the obviously to the heart of what we do. Um, and I do think that those kinds of and I don't want to be too flip about it. But I do think that those kinds of issues have been with journalism from the beginning. Everything from sponsors and advertisers to owners of papers. I think obviously these are a little bit more complex because uh, what we're looking at here is sharing of information. We're also looking at privacy issues that are incredibly important um, and dangerous. The potential for the danger is there. So yeah, I do think that those relationships have to be entered into very carefully, and I think there has to be very clear lines of where your partnership ends and where your job as a journalist and as a watchdog begins. Just on a very small scale, and this is very small, but we have the AP Google Scholarship. This is our last year with it, but it was a partnership between AP and Google and ourselves to, as I mentioned before, I think to hand out these scholarships, which is a great thing, right? Very beneficial.
Right.
But at the same time, we immediately have to start thinking, okay, now we are partnering with Google. What is our how do we figure out when something happens with Google as a journalism organization that we don't feel comfortable with? Can we still feel as though we're going to come out against that? And of course we would. I mean, there's no question about that. But it's a discussion I think that we had to have before we even entered into that relationship, even though there was probably very little chance that something would happen.
Right.
And I think that that's
I mean,
where,
this is all the more fraught right now with the role of the tech, or the way that the tech companies are tied into like national surveillance or surveillance and national security type concerns, which are obviously salient for journalists and news gathering.
absolutely. So I do think that there has to be, and I think most media organizations who are approaching this have even more reason to. They're tying their finances up with these companies too. Have more reason to be very circumspect and also very clear when they're when they sit down to talk about the ethical responsibilities of where those lie, and hopefully they're doing that.
Right.
So.
Um, we should probably wrap up in a couple minutes. I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about local news in particular, and what's happening in the digital space with respect to local coverage. Um, there's, I mean, an argument that you sort of see with increasing frequency. Well, maybe not with increasing, but an argument you come across pretty often is that local news coverage is kind of in a the is facing a bet that the audience for local news was never actually that high, and that sort of the nature of the news industry in the second half of the 20th century sort of artificially overproduced local news, and as we've had with the rise of the internet and the great unbundling and fragmentation of the audience, et cetera, we're finding out that the audience for local news is not as high as maybe we thought. At the same time, there's obviously a tremendous part of what's happening in the this sort of moment of digital innovation and experimentation is that there's a lot of really interesting and exciting local news startups, some of which are doing a great job in terms of engagement on civic affairs, like Voice of San Diego gets a lot of plaudits. Others are doing, really innovative digital stuff like Access Philly. I know won an award from you guys recently, and we wrote about their work on text coverage. At the same time, they're facing some pretty serious questions to the business model. And we recently published a piece by Brendan Ian that reviewed some recent research and sort of some research to the effect that when newspapers close, and it looked at there's been research on closings in Cincinnati and Seattle and Denver in the past 5 years or so. Local civic engagement and local political engagement drops off, and the theory is that there's essentially sort of like incidental news that gets sort of conveyed in the news bundle, in the bundle that the newspaper represented, and that that helps support this engagement. And perhaps even like a really sort of high quality startup isn't reaching as many people, or isn't sort of communicating information to as many people and having that same effect. So I guess a couple of questions I guess one question I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on is worrying about how to recreate a particular benefit that newspapers may have had a fruitful way to think about sort of challenges that we want digital innovators to take on. And just more broadly, what are you sort of most excited about or most worried about in sort of the local news space?
Yeah, I would. It's funny because I'm not worried about the local news space. I think last year, I don't know if you had a chance to see this or not, Greg, but last year, Knight and Pew did a roundtable that I happened to be at, and it was based on a study they had done looking at nonprofit news organizations. So the nonprofit news organizations, and there were about 10 of them there, along with funders and some of the other foundations, were surprisingly very optimistic. Even ones who were not doing that well financially, but very optimistic about maybe not so much their business models, because they're still struggling with that, but the hunger they're seeing for what they're doing. And most of those organizations are local, I would say, with the exception of maybe ProPublica, who was there. And even ProPublica, I mean, it's a very issues-oriented, investigative journalism, public good organization. So
Right.
My feeling is not that we're losing a lot of local news. It's that it's just morphing, and that there's actually a lot more opportunity, and I see a lot of new, especially in that group that 10 to 20, or however many people were there. I see a lot of opportunity there where they are picking up the slack from, not only just picking up the slack from the newspapers, but also expanding, that the idea of what local news is. They are, and they're doing that through, obviously using some tools, new tools, but also, I think, sort of redefining what local news means. Where I see the problem is in, I think, more of the political bodies and the courts. Is coverage is dropping, really dropping there, and there's not anything. I'm not seeing anything that's coming in to replace that, and that's pretty dangerous, I think. I know that
I'm
there's
sorry, coverage of the political bodies in the courts, you said?
yes, yeah. I don't think that the coverage of state houses, the coverage of district courts, it has pretty much fallen away as newsrooms have gotten smaller, and there hasn't been a ton of increase in or replacement for that. So I worry about that a lot, as a lot of journalists do, that we're missing sort of that watchdog. First of all, the watchdog piece of it, who's keeping an eye on this, but also what you're missing in terms of what the public's learning about what's happening.
Right. Yeah. And I probably when I was sort of talking about local news, I sort of meant from sort of like city council up to sort of state house level, and inclusive of local courts. And I probably wasn't clear enough, but
yeah, I guess then in that case, yeah, I would say that is a concern, and I don't really know what I haven't seen a lot of movement to help replace that. That I know that Pew has done a really great job with their state initiatives, and that's been helpful. But I think a lot more is needed.
right. Well, on that sunny note,
Maybe you should ask me one more question so I can be a little more hopeful.
um, so how do you? Do you have any thoughts on on how to? This is the sort of the question that sort of we've been worrying about for 5-6 years, right? Like the state house level coverage, and in places, in Texas Tribune. Capital coverage in Texas is really sort of the Tribune's beat, and it's doing that. And there's a collaborative, certainly the out in California, California Watch has done good work. Do you see sort of, and there are places like, so Sunlight Foundation is forever coming up with new tools to sort of facilitate and to in some sense sort of like automate the legwork of sort of beginning reporting. You've got to build on them with sort of like follow-up work, but there are, I feel like, increasing. Well, there continue to be efforts to tackle this problem and to provide resources and to sort of build collaborations. Are there any of those that you see as sort of particularly promising or untried ideas that are sort of ripe for tackling?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned the ones that I would point out myself, and there probably are others that I'm not aware of. I know that, and this is also another place where some technology and tools companies have kind of tried to step into the breach, with sort of FOIA, making it easier for people to file FOIA and others, and I'm sure there'll be more. But no, I don't see. I think what you're looking at is the optimum, right? Which is total coverage, which is every state is. You feel as though you're seeing good journalism being produced, or at least, if nothing else, just good reporting on what's happening. But no, I don't see that happening, and I hope I'm wrong. I'd love to hear from people who are doing things that we're not aware of, and we can help to spread the word.
Well, likewise for CJR.
Yep.
Well, that was a little more positive,
Okay, good.
At least we name checked, some of the good efforts.
Thank you. I feel better now.
Okay. All right. Well, it's good to talk to you, Jane.
You too, Greg. Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye-bye now.